In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you all for having me. I'm always so blessed to be invited to these talks. So thank you guys for allowing me to come and to kind of guest speak today. Always a great blessing. So when I talked about the topic with Sarah, we talked about this concept of we're still in the Holy 50 days. Let's do something on resurrection. And so this talk is based on how do we prove the resurrection, and how do we prove it through a little bit of history, a little bit of scholarly, and of course biblical. And the reason behind that, kind of why we chose this topic, is because resurrection, if we break it down, is the seal or the stamp of Christianity, right? Resurrection is kind of like the cherry on top. It's kind of like the thing that validates this faith of ours, right? The stamp, as you see on my screen there. And why is that the case? Like, why is resurrection such a big deal? And many times, we're often talking about the crucifixion, which is so important, right? Like the crucifixion and salvation, the blood. But without resurrection, the story isn't complete. The mission isn't complete. Like, you don't complete the game, or you don't pass the game without the resurrection. And so we'll focus today on the resurrection and how do we actually prove the resurrection. So the first thing is, why is resurrection so important, right? It's the seal or the stamp of Christianity. And resurrection does four things for us, which is why we're going to kind of focus on this concept today. One, it authenticates Christ as the Son of God. Okay, and we see in Romans 1:4 there, the verse, right? It really authenticates that Christ, in fact, was the Son of God. And this is obviously logic. If Christ came and did his mission and preached and he healed and he taught and then he crucified and he died and that was it, then he doesn't authenticate who he says he is. Okay? So his divinity is authenticated by the resurrection, not the crucifixion, but the resurrection. Two, it proves the atoning value of Christ's work, which St. Paul tells us, who was delivered up because of our offenses and was raised up because of our justification. Three, it ensures mine and your salvation. If Christ has not risen, your faith is futile. Okay? Your faith is futile, right? It's irrelevant if Christ does not rise and defeat death. And four, it establishes the authenticity of the Bible. Christ is God, therefore the Bible is inspired through divine intervention. If you look at a scholarly view of Christianity, many scholars will agree with you on certain concepts. Christ existed, Christ was born, Christ died. But when it gets to the resurrection, that's where you have a lot of noise around, wait a second, this is a little bit different now. Now he's resurrecting. Now he's defeating death. This has never happened before, and this is where we get a lot of challenges. I'll tell you a quick story as to why I kind of came up with this talk. When I was in university, whatever, 15, 20 years ago, I was part of the Coptic Club. And as the president of the club, we sat with other denominations and we would discuss things about our religion. And when it came to the concept of resurrection, a lot of other denominations had a really hard time with this. And so when we would debate and I would bring up, Bible verses, they'd say, well, you can't bring up Bible verses. That's kind of like bias, right? Show us history, show us proof, show us, other areas of facets. So we'll focus today on how do we prove the resurrection from that type of perspective. Again, scholarly, historically, logically, and biblically, and hopefully we can all learn something and we can kind of move forward together as a family. And if anybody has any questions or comments, please interrupt me or write in the chat. This is more hopefully as a discussion. So before we dive right into proving the resurrection, we got to take a step back first. And we got to take it in kind of baby steps. So the first thing we do is that we got to prove that Christ existed and that he in fact died. Okay, to get to resurrection, there has to be an existence and there has to be a death. So that's the first step. Okay, and this is more of a historical overview. So you'll find that historically, we know that Christ existed. And we know this through the writings of a lot of historical scholars, one of them being Josephus. So for those of you who don't know who Josephus is, he's a very famous historian, a Jewish historian. His name was Flavius Josephus, and he was around 37 to 100 AD. A commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee. He was employed by the Flavian emperors, and he mentions Jesus several times in historical writings, okay? So not the Bible. This is now history that says a man named Jesus existed at this time, and this is fact, okay? In the Jewish Antiquities, which is one of Josephus's writings, historically, he writes this passage here. And it says here, I'll read it very quickly, About this time there lived a man named Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, was a teacher of such people, and as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Okay, again, this is not a Bible verse. Okay, this is not written by the apostles or the disciples. This is a historian who was alive, who wrote what he saw in historical concept. Okay, so we know that Christ existed, and in fact, this verse actually even kind of goes a little deeper. He was the Messiah. He did wonders, appeared to them on the third day. Christians are still around today. They haven't disappeared. So it goes above and beyond just Christ, existing. Okay. Then the question is, well, did he really die? Okay, so he existed. Can we prove that he actually died? So funny enough, when I was doing this research, there is actually zero dispute among scholars or historians that Christ actually died. Like, it's a unanimous thumbs up. Yes, Christ existed, and yes, he actually died. And the reason for that was because what was Roman crucifixion? Okay, if anybody's on this call and knows what crucifixion is, it's a very brutal, a very gory way to die. Right? The crucifixion comes from the word asphyxiation, where you suffocate. There's loss of blood. There's so many things that you do on the cross that one can't survive, let alone the beating that comes before going on the cross. So there's actually zero dispute among scholars that Christ actually died. Did you know that there is no historical record found anywhere ever that anybody has ever survived a Roman crucifixion? Again, because of how brutal the path of death actually is. The Journal of the American Medical Association, they said, clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Okay, so they did a bit of an investigation based on biological trends of somebody in that state, and they said there's no way he was even alive before that spear hit him. And many other atheist scholars confirm and agree that there's no doubt that Jesus in fact died. Gerd Ludemann here, who I have one of his quotes, he's actually an atheist scholar, and he's from the University of Vanderbilt, and he writes that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Okay, so we know that historically and scholarly, there is no question that Christ existed and Christ in fact died. Okay, now we go into the resurrection. So now we go into the concept that a lot of people struggle with scholarly is, well, did he actually resurrect? Because now we're talking about the supernatural. Okay, did he actually resurrect? So for us to prove the resurrection, we're going to prove a bunch of different aspects first. The first one is being the empty tomb. Okay, was the tomb actually empty? How do we prove that? Right, because if there's a body inside, then there's no resurrection. So how do we prove that the tomb was actually empty? Where did the disciples first preach? Okay, so we know it was Jerusalem. And why is that significant? Why is the disciples preaching in Jerusalem significant? The answer is because it's the same place as his death. Okay, so the entire city, entire town knew where the tomb was. Okay, everyone knew where he was buried, where he was going. It wasn't like it was hidden somewhere in the wilderness where only the VIPs knew where it was. The entire city knew where he was buried. And that's significant because it's also the same place where the disciples preached. So as the disciples are preaching the resurrection and the tomb is in the city where everyone knows, it's very simple to prove that they're lying, right? Go inside and find the body. So that to me tells me that there's some significance that the tomb being in Jerusalem where the disciples first preached tells me also that there must have been an empty tomb. Okay? And this is the logic that we just talked about. Paul Alphaeus, another scholar, says, it could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. Okay? It would have been, proven wrong so quickly because everybody knew where that burial site was. What about the stolen body theory? Does anybody know what the stolen body theory is? I can't see if anybody's on the call, so if you want to interrupt me, go ahead. Has anybody heard of the stolen body theory? The stolen body theory is referenced in Matthew 28 and in the Toleth Jesu, which is a Jewish historical writing. Okay, and basically it's the theory that the disciples stole the body. Okay, so Christ was not in the tomb because the disciples stole it or somebody stole it. That's the stolen body theory, and it's found in Matthew and in texts outside of the Bible. Why is this significant? How does this actually prove the tomb was empty? Okay, why would they admit the tomb was empty unless the evidence was too strong to be denied? This is called positive evidence from a hostile source. And what that means is that if the source admits that the fact is not in its favor, the fact is actually genuine. And this is also referenced, if those of you guys are in law school, called enemy attestation. So for people to say that the disciples stole the body, what does that in fact prove? That the tomb was empty. Okay, that's why they're bringing up other reasons why it's empty. But what it actually proves to us is the tomb was actually empty. Why did they resort to this accusation and not just to advise to open the tomb? Because it was actually empty. This is called enemy attestation. When I tell my teacher in school, the dog ate my homework, what am I admitting? I don't have the homework, right? Here's the excuse, but what I'm admitting is I have not done it, okay? My wife comes home and says, why is the house a mess? I say the house is a mess because the baby did so forth. What am I admitting? The house is a mess, okay? The baby did it or the baby trashed or whatever, but I'm admitting the house is a mess. The stolen body theory proves that the tomb was actually empty, right? Obviously, the theory is a theory, and nobody believes that the body was stolen. But for this purpose, what it shows us is we have an empty tomb here, and that's significant. What about Joseph of Arimathea? Now, you've heard this name before. Why is he important to this empty tomb proof? Why is he significant? So we know he's the one who buried Jesus, and he's member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish Supreme Court. Well, so what? What does that mean? Being a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin means you were a very notorious figure, okay? People who knew who you were. You were known around the whole city. Everyone knew you were a big deal. You were a VIP. You carried some weight, okay? Everyone knew who you were. So for him to be a part of this story means that it couldn't have been made up. It had to have been factual. Matt Perman writes here, another scholar, people on this ruling class were simply too well known for fictitious stories about them to be pulled off in this way. This would have exposed the Christians as frauds. Okay, so it wasn't just the disciples who were involved in the story of Christ. There were other figures who were historically known in other different facets and occupations, Jewish Supreme Court, that equate to this story. And that's why this is significant in our empty tomb proof. Okay? You ever seen a shrine of Christ, anybody? Okay, has anybody ever heard of the shrine of Christ? Well, why is this important? So his tomb was never actually venerated as a shrine. And this is striking because in first century custom, it was, again, custom that a shrine should be set up at any holy man's bones. Okay? And there were so many other sites where there was these shrines in the first century, but there was never one found for Jesus. And the reason is because there were never bones found. There was never a body found. Okay, and that's why to this day there is no actual shrine. Yet there are shrines of so many other figures historically, but not for Christ. So another important facet as why there is an empty tomb. This is the last one here and how we prove the empty tomb, and I really like this one here. So if I were to ask you who discovered the tomb, you would say the women did, right? The women were the first people that went and discovered the tomb very early Sunday morning. Okay. Why is this important? This proof is called the criterion of embarrassment. Again, for those of you guys who are in law school or who are lawyers, you would have heard this phrase here. In the old days, historians would use this test to determine if an ancient writer was telling the truth. And they would do this by saying, if the writer reports something that is embarrassing to themselves, it's likely to be true, okay? Called the criterion of embarrassment. So how does this help us in our proof for the empty tomb? In that time, women were seen as what? Second-class citizens, right? They didn't really have a voice. They didn't testify in court. They were second class. So if they're the ones that found the tomb, or if the author of the gospel was making something up, chances are the author would change that to say men found it first. Why? Because men's testimony is probably more credible, because they're seen as to be more, with more validity than women were. So that would have been changed. William Lane Craig writes, if the empty tomb story were a legend, it is most likely that the male disciples would have been made the first to discover the empty tomb. The fact that despised women whose testimony was deemed worthless were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if, like it or not, they actually were the discoverers of the empty tomb. Okay? What that means in English is, if the disciples were to have made up the story, they would have said men discovered the tomb to boost the credibility. Okay? Not only that, but we know that at that time, what were the disciples doing? I mean, they were hiding, right? They were frightened. The fact that the women were the ones who were brave and gone in first, if I was the author, I might have changed that and said, well, hang on, this is embarrassing to me or to disciples. Let's change the concept here. This is called the criterion of embarrassment. So the fact that the tomb was discovered by women and that was remained in the text shows us that it was actually discovered and the tomb was actually empty. And this is a proof that I really enjoyed learning about, called the criterion of embarrassment. Okay? Again, if anybody has any questions, please interrupt me and ask away. So now we go into the resurrection appearances. So we proved that Christ existed, that he in fact died, and we proved that the tomb was empty. Okay? Now we go into the actual resurrection. Okay? And how do we, prove the resurrection? Well, eyewitness accounts, right? Let's see where he appeared. Okay? 1 Corinthians 5, chapter 3, this is called the Creed. So historians and scholars call this the Creed. This is Paul writing who saw Christ, when they saw Christ, and that Christ actually was seen after his death. Okay? And he writes here in 1 Corinthians 15, I delivered to you first of all, which has received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. And he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by the apostles. The last of all, he was seen by me. This is called the Creed. This is St. Paul letting those know that Christ resurrected, and here are all the folks that saw him. Pay attention to verse 6 here, where it says, after that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But this is called the Creed, okay? And why is this creed important? Why is this creed significant? Let's discuss it historically, okay? This letter, if we actually trace it back, was written about 20 to 30 years after the crucifixion. So St. Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians 20 to 30 years after the crucifixion. So someone might say, well, it's like broken telephone. 30 years later, he may have changed that, he may have changed this, so it's not factual, okay? Sure, let's go down that path. Scholars tell us, actually, that Paul probably received this testimony from James and Peter about 3 years after the crucifixion, okay? How do we know that? We know that through Galatians 1. In Galatians 1, Paul tells us that he meets with Peter and James for about 15 days, right? This is actually in Galatians 1. And they discuss something which is a Greek term called historia, okay? And what that means is that Peter and James were passing on eyewitness knowledge and eyewitness testimony to Paul. And what we know is that Peter and James were actually eyewitnesses, right? As Paul mentioned, we know that Peter and James were eyewitnesses. So this tells us, in fact, that there's likely no time gap from when the information was passed, okay? So that 20 to 30 years may have been written later on, but the information was passed almost immediately after Christ died and was resurrected, okay? Again, Paul meets with Peter and James for 15 days, and they discuss historia, which is information that is passed on firsthand from eyewitness, okay? So what we know is that this creed couldn't have been a legend. It must have been the truth, okay? James D.G. Dunn, he writes, this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed within months of Jesus' death. This is why this creed in 1 Corinthians is very important. Fun fact, the University of Oxford did a study on legends in the ancient world, okay? They studied legends or myths or stories or fibs that were created in the ancient world. And they wanted to understand how long did it take for a legend to develop. Okay, does anybody know? Anyone take a guess? How long do you think it took for a legend in the ancient world to develop? Anybody want to take a guess? I can't see who. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say a long time.
A long time, absolutely. So it actually took 2 generations. So the University of Oxford concluded that in the ancient world, it took 2 generations for a legend to be created or to develop. Okay? This is information that was passed on immediately after and written 30 years later. So we know that this creed is not a legend. It's in fact the passing of eyewitness testimony. And that's why this creed in 1 Corinthians is very important. Okay? So, resurrection appearances. Now we go into eyewitness accounts. Okay? Now, why is this important? I ask any of you guys today in a court of law today, if you were speeding and you committed a crime, or someone committed a crime and you went to court and it's my word against your word. Well, how does the judge prove the truth? What does the judge seek? Well, who saw it? Who saw you speed? Who saw you commit the crime? The eyewitness testimony is deemed as, above law in some cases. So in our situation here, who are the eyewitness accounts and where is their significance? Okay, let's discuss that. So did you know that there are actually 9 ancient sources found inside and outside the New Testament that confirm the disciples truly encountered the risen Christ? We talked about the creed in 1 Corinthians. There's also Paul's testimonial in 1 Corinthians 15. There's Peter in Acts, okay, who writes, "This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses." There's the Gospels, which have 9 appearances by the risen Christ. We have the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, which mentions the resurrections 5 times. This is not in the Bible. And we have a letter written by Clement to Corinth, where he talks about the resurrection, that the apostles were completely certain that the resurrection of our Lord Christ existed. Okay? So we have eyewitness accounts found inside and outside the Bible that talk about the risen Christ. Okay? And the last letter from Clement to Corinth, he writes, the apostles had complete certainty caused by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Remember that atheist scholar we talked about earlier, Luderman? Again, atheist, right? Look at what he writes here. He says, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Thus, we are in basic agreement that following Jesus' crucifixion, various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Christ alive from the dead." Right? This is an atheist scholar who's saying that we conclude that the disciples truly saw him, okay, or at least truly believed that they saw him. That's concluded. Okay? So a lot of you are probably asking, well, how does an atheist say that? Well, why is he still atheist? Okay? Let's play devil's advocate. Okay? We know that the disciples had the experiences. They truly saw Christ. Okay? But let's play devil's advocate. Okay? There might have been 3 scenarios. 1, they were lying. The disciples were lying. So they made up a lie. Sometimes you believe your lie and you go down the path and so forth. Maybe they were hallucinating. Okay? Maybe they were daydreaming. Maybe they were imagining. Maybe they were in such a state of like fear or hunger, or where the mind plays tricks on you and they were hallucinating. Or the 3rd scenario is, yeah, they truly saw the risen Christ. Let's go down some of this together. Okay? Did they lie? Were the disciples lying? Unlikely. Why? We know that the majority of the disciples were martyrs, right? So they willingly gave their lives for this faith or for this movement. Okay? And I'll ask you guys with some logic here. Would you or would they give up their lives for something they knew was to be a lie? Like if you're living on a lie and now comes time to the point of death, that's the moment where you turn back on your lie and say, you know what? Actually, here's the truth. Okay? But majority of the disciples died as martyrs. Would you give up your life for something you knew was a lie? Likely, unlikely. Okay? Matt Perman writes again, because of the absurdity of the theory that the disciples were lying, we can see why almost all scholars today admit that if nothing else, the disciples at least believed that Christ appeared to them. Right? They believed it, right? Whether it happened or not, they actually believed they weren't lying. We don't for a second believe that the disciples were lying, right? Believing something to be true doesn't make it true though, right? We know that. So let's play some more devil's advocate, right? Perhaps they were deceived by a hallucination or by a dream or by something that was, clouding up their thoughts where they couldn't see properly. Were they hallucinating? Let's go down this path. Unlikely, because the disciples, they record physical encounters with Christ, like eating, like touching, like intimacy, like things that are just physical, okay? And what's even more interesting is that it's very unlikely that all the disciples would experience the exact same hallucination, right? Hallucinations are very individual. They're not group projections, right? Like I can't wake up from my dream and say, hey, babe, I had the best dream ever. Come join me. Go to sleep and join me in my dream. I can't do that because hallucinations are individual. They're not group projections, okay? And remember I told you guys that creed, that verse 6, 500 people saw Christ at once, okay? Imagine having the same dream experienced and felt by hundreds of people. They don't work that way, let alone for 500 people. If you follow Lee Strobel, who writes The Case of Christ, who talks a lot about these proofs, he says here, he goes to interview a psychologist who's an expert in hallucination. And the psychologist says to him, 500 people with the same hallucination would be a miracle by itself, right? Again, hallucinations are very individual. It's impossible that a group of people, let alone more than 2 or 3, can experience the same hallucination the same way at the same time. Very unlikely, right? And finally, we know that Saul, who is Paul, experiences Christ years later on the road to Damascus. Is that the same hallucination that the disciples felt? Again, hallucinations are very individual. They're not group predictions. So therefore, the disciples could not have been lying or hallucinating. What we conclude is that they believed they saw Christ because they in fact did see the risen Christ. Okay? So we talked about the existence of Christ, execution, we talked about the empty tomb, we talked about the creed, the eyewitness accounts. We proved the disciples actually weren't lying, they weren't hallucinating, that they actually saw the risen Christ. What about their behavior? Okay? How does their behavior prove the resurrection? Okay? Did you know, fun fact, that Jewish beliefs are actually very contradictory to the resurrection, right? Like the Jewish belief of afterlife completely contradicts the resurrection, right? So where do these disciples believe this concept so passionately? Like they're all Jews and some of them are fishermen and some of them weren't highly educated. So where did they learn this concept of resurrection that goes against their Jewish upbringing, okay? And why do they believe it so passionately? Let's examine their behavior. Okay, Luke Johnson, another historical scholar, writes, some sort of powerful transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. Okay, N.T. Wright says, that is why as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Let's look at their behavior. Okay, at the cross or before the cross, what do you see? You see fear. Right? You see denial. You see, Christ was almost kind of abandoned by a majority of the disciples because they were scared. What do you see post-resurrection? You see boldness. You see fearless. You see strength. You see courage, right? You see all these things that weren't there. How does that transform overnight? Unless you saw something supernatural that knocked you out of your socks, that made your hair stand up, that made you say, this is the real deal, that's how your behavior changes overnight to becoming so brave. Right? We have to examine their behavior to say, yes, they were telling the truth and they must have saw something that really rocked them to say, wow, like it's above our own logic, our understanding. So their behavior shows us that, yeah, Christ resurrected and he appeared to them. What about St. Paul, right? What about the conversion of skeptics, right? We know what Saul was, right? The biggest skeptic of all time, right? And he becomes Paul. How does that happen? How does that transform? There had to have been an out of body, an out of mind experience to say, oh my goodness, like this is unheard of. Like, again, knocking you off your socks, like to say, this is the real deal. The behavior of the apostles and the disciples, by examining how they transform so quickly, shows us that they must have actually seen the resurrected Christ. What about the growth of the early church? Why is that important? Okay, during the first few centuries, Christianity spread very quickly. Right? We know that Christianity had no military or no political power, right? No weapons, no swords, no tanks, no army, no empire, nothing, and no political influence. So how does this small movement of disciples and fishermen, how does it spread so fast, right? Joshua Swimdis writes, how did a small band of disempowered Jews in an occupied and insignificant territory of ancient Rome accomplish this unequaled act? Okay, how did they continue to get people to follow them and follow them and follow them when they were a minority? No strength, no power, no influence. How does that happen? It only happens by the resurrection existing, by apostles and disciples seeing the resurrected Christ to say this faith is real. It is not futile, right? It is valid because it is not, a God that's dead, but a living God. And that's why the resurrection is so important. And through the growth of the early church, we prove that resurrection continues by the church expanding and the church growing. What about early prophecies? Well, why is that important? Okay. So if you've heard the term radiometric analysis, what that is that's how historians and scholars they use this way of analyzing text to confirm that Old Testament writings are indeed well dating before New Testament manuscripts. It's called radiometric analysis, and it just looks at the text or the context and says, yes, this was in fact written thousands of years before the text that we have today. Okay, and what's interesting, and many of you guys know this, is that many of these prophecies include very specific details of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Right? Many of these details found in the Old Testament are things that couldn't have been humanly controlled. I'll give you an example. Okay, Psalm 22, verse 16. Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me, they pierce my hands and my feet. Right? Interesting thing here is that Romans invented crucifixions hundreds of years later. So the time that this psalm was written, there was no crucifixion. So how does someone write that, hands are pierced and so forth? Right? There are certain elements of the prophecies in our Bible that aren't humanly controlled. And that's why, our faith is so amazing and so beautiful, because it's complete like a nice, well put puzzle where prophecies and they're fulfilled and they're, the details and specifics and, the Jeremiah on Good Friday, the Lamentations, like it's so beautifully done because the prophecies are fulfilled, and some of them, again, they're so detailed that they couldn't have been manipulated or controlled. Psalm 16:10, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Okay, so through early prophecies and radiometric analysis, we also prove resurrection existed through the prophecies that were fulfilled and for how specific they were in their detail. So if we're to summarize today, okay, this is how we prove the resurrection. Okay, the existence and the execution, we prove that Christ existed and died through Josephus' writing. We prove the tomb was empty through different venues, right? We said enemy attestation, criterion of embarrassment through the women finding the tomb, the stolen body theory, and the fact Joseph of Arimathea, where the tomb was located. We proved the tomb was actually empty. We talked about resurrection appearances through the creed that St. Paul writes. We talked about eyewitness accounts. We talked about the behavior of the disciples, the growth of the early church, and early prophecies. Okay, this is how we prove the resurrection existed, historically, scholarly, and through the Bible. But what's the most important factor? Okay, what's the most important factor that we want to all leave home with today? Faith trumps all the proof in the world. Okay, if I'm being honest with you all, this should have been my first slide, but for the sake of this talk, I left it to the end. But really, where are we without our faith? Okay, I can sit here and give you guys proofs until you're blue in the face. Resurrection, crucifixion, thousands of proofs. But where are we, and how do we stand up tall and flaunt our chest without our faith? Okay, our Lord was so clear to Thomas and said, Thomas, because you have seen me and you have believed, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Where are we without our faith? There has to be a level of faith to say, I trust, I believe in my heart. Dale Martin, I'll read this quote to you, is a professor at the University of Yale, obviously an Ivy League school. Look at what he writes here. He says, I teach students how to read the Bible from a critical, historical perspective, but that's not the only way to read this text. If you need the Bible to be confirmed by modern historiography in order to be true, then you're putting your faith in historiography and not in God. and that's idolatry. As a believer, I put my faith in God. I can't explain why I have faith. I just have it. Okay? I love this quote here. And the last part there, I can't explain why I have faith. I just have it. Like, what is that it? And do you have it? Do I have it? Do we have it? It's great to have proof. It's great to go through scholars and historically and all that stuff and logic. At the end of the day, if I don't have faith in my heart, right, my faith should be the trumping card that defeats all this proof in the world. So I hope we all kind of discussed together today and we got something out of all of this. It's great to be here, and I pray for the blessings of the resurrection, that we can all continue to grow in our faith, closer and closer to Christ, as through his resurrection he defeats death and he conquers in our hearts as well. Glory be to God forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Neda, for a really great talk. Wow, that's a lot of information. And I just have a question. If someone is struggling with the idea, or as you said, like your friends when you were in the Coptic group, they were like, hey, we want something that's not from the Bible. Like, there's a lot of resource, like you've done a lot of research there, and there's a lot of sources. So where can they start? Is there a book? Do they just go on Google? Like, what can you advise someone who wants to start looking outside of the Bible?
Yeah, there are so many things. And I started this by looking at historical texts. So like you can go into like, Josephus is just one of many, but there's so many other texts outside the Bible through the lens of history that talk about, some of this stuff, right? Like Lee Strobel is a renowned author who writes about the case for Christ and the case for God. And he was actually not an atheist, right? So you'll find these texts outside the Bible. You'll also find writings of other, historical figures or saints or church fathers or, Clement, for example, or Polycarp. Not biblical, but there's writings outside the Bible that have some of this stuff. But for me, I started with history. Like, let me see what history says about a man named Christ and what he did. And I started there. And through that, you kind of go into other aspects. So now we go into resurrection. Maybe I'll look at some scholars. Again, Lerderman, who's atheist, or N.T. Wright, or Joshua Swindis. These are all very renowned historians, scholars that have different writings. So yeah, Google is one of them. Books that you find, whether it's that you buy or that you kind of, there's no more libraries these days, but you can find these texts in various ways of streams. My advice would be just search it, research it, and one will lead you to the other, and you'll continue going and going until you kind of get what you want. But I think ultimately, Philo, it does come back to the Bible, and the Bible really, again, it trumps it all. Like all of these teachings and writings and these scholars and these letters, it leads back to the Bible, and that's still where we hold our head strong to say our faith in our Bible is where it kind of leads back to. But yes, there's so many different other streams you can go to.
For sure. And I can see you spent a lot of time getting to that research. It's a lot. So thank you for spending this time to get the information. I'm sure it's packed. I will rewatch the YouTube because there's a lot of, scholars and what they write in books. So thank you, Neda, again for coming. And thanks everyone for joining. I can see some of us are on YouTube today. I know the weather is beautiful. If it's your first time and you want to join our mailing list, we just send one email every week. It's OnRoute at smsv.ca. We're still taking ideas for topics or series, so if you have any ideas or feedback, please send it to us. And I hope you all enjoy this Sunday.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Nader. And